My name is Dana. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my working life I drove a white Honda Civic across Houston before sunrise, letting myself into other people's homes when the city was still dark. I worked as a home health aide for 5 years, mostly serving elderly clients in the Pearland and Sugarland suburbs south of the city. The work meant early mornings, careful hands, and the ability to make someone feel dignified when getting out of bed had become the hardest part of their day. It wasn't the kind of job that earned you particular respect at family gatherings, but it taught me things I couldn't have learned anywhere else: how to pay attention, how to notice the details other people miss, and how to keep moving through discomfort without letting it show on your face. My brother Philip never understood any of that. He's 11 years older than me, and by the time I was old enough to observe what our family actually valued, Philip had already become the benchmark for all of it. He finished his medical degree at UT Health, completed his residency, and opened his first urgent care clinic in the Heights neighborhood when he was 32. Over the following decade, he expanded it into 3 locations spread across the northwest Houston suburbs. His name was on the buildings in gold letters: Philip J. Whitfield, MD. Which was the kind of detail my mother mentioned to distant relatives whether they had asked or not. At holiday dinners, Philip occupied the largest chair at the table, the way certain people occupy every room they enter. Not rudely, exactly, but with a settled certainty that the room had been arranged for them. His wife sat beside him. His 2 boys ran through the house. My mother kept his glass filled before he noticed it was empty. I sat at the far end and answered questions about whether I was seeing anyone. The evening I remember most clearly happened in October, 2 years ago. Philip had just opened his 3rd location, a renovated clinic off the Katy Freeway, and was throwing a grand opening celebration to market. Investors were there, hospital administrators, representatives from the insurance networks his practice billed through. My mother had spent 3 weeks telling me I had to come, so I drove up from Pearland in slacks and a dark blazer, which I thought was appropriate until I walked through the door and realized I had dressed for a Tuesday afternoon, and everyone else had dressed for something entirely different. Philip found me near the appetizer table before I'd had time to figure out where to stand. He was moving through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to work a crowd, the same way he'd learned to read an X-ray, efficiently, without wasted motion. He steered me toward a cluster of men in suits and sport coats and said, loud enough for the whole group to hear clearly, "Gentlemen, this is my baby sister Dana. She's in the caregiving business." He paused for exactly the right beat, then smiled at his audience. What that means, practically speaking, is that she helps senior citizens remember what day of the week it is, and make sure the TV remote hasn't fallen behind the couch cushions. The men laughed. One said something about how somebody had to do it. Another clapped Philip on the shoulder. Philip smiled at me the way people smile when they believe they've said something affectionate, then turned the conversation back to expansion timelines and reimbursement rates. I stood there holding a crab cake I no longer had any interest in eating, smiling until it felt like a mechanical function, and then excused myself to the parking lot. I sat in my car for a long time before I drove home. What Philip didn't know, what none of them knew, was that for the past 8 months, I had been working through a certification curriculum in healthcare compliance every single evening after my shifts ended. I sat at my kitchen table and studied Medicare billing, regulations, federal anti-kickback statutes, and HIPAA documentation requirements until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I wasn't doing it to impress anyone. I was doing it because 5 years of working inside the healthcare system, even at its periphery, had shown me how many places it leaked. How many billing decisions were made carelessly? How many small errors compounded over time into serious legal exposure? How much damage could have been avoided if someone had simply been paying attention from the beginning? I had been paying attention my entire career. I had simply never been in a position where it counted for anything. I mentioned the coursework once in passing, at dinner the previous spring. My mother said, "That's interesting, sweetheart," and immediately turned the conversation back to Philip's upcoming contract negotiation with a major insurance carrier. I didn't bring it up again. I passed the healthcare compliance professional examination the following February. First attempt. A few weeks later, I received a call from a man named Mr. O.C., who ran a boutique compliance consulting firm in Midtown Houston. He had seen me studying at a coffee shop near one of my clients' homes and had asked what I was working on. He kept my contact information, and when an analyst position opened at his firm several months later, he thought of me first. The salary he offered was nearly double what I earned as an aide. I accepted without hesitation and didn't mention it to my family for 3 months. When my mother eventually found out I'd changed jobs, she asked what I was doing now. I said compliance analysis. She asked if that was similar to accounting. I said it was related to healthcare billing regulation. She said, "Oh," in a tone that meant she'd filed the information in the category of things she didn't need to retain, and then asked whether I'd seen Philip's Instagram post about his practice being named one of the top-rated urgent care providers in Harris County. I had not. 11 months after the grand opening, a manila envelope appeared on my desk on a Tuesday morning. Mr. O.C. came to my office around 10 o'clock, sat across from me, and closed the door before he started talking. He explained that the firm had been retained by a regional Medicare Advantage insurer to conduct an independent internal review of a Houston area urgent care provider. The carrier's audit division had flagged an unusually high pattern of evaluation and management claims billed at the highest complexity level, codes that reimbursed at nearly 3 times the rate of a standard office visit, across 3 clinic locations. Preliminary analysis indicated that the supporting documentation in the medical records did not reflect the level of service billed in a significant number of cases. Based on claim volumes across a 30-month period, the insurer's actuaries had estimated the total exposure at approximately $4.7 million in potentially miscoded reimbursements. He slid the top page of the file across the desk. The provider name on the first line was Whitfield Urgent Care Associates. I kept my eyes on the page and my face still. That was something compliance work had trained into me, the discipline of reading a document without letting your reaction lead the analysis. "You'll be lead analyst on the documentation review," Mr. O.C. said. "Site visits begin next week." I set the page down. "There's something I need to tell you first." He already knew. He told me he'd identified the relationship before making the assignment and had given it serious consideration. He believed I was capable of maintaining professional objectivity, but the decision was entirely mine. If at any point I felt the situation was affecting my analysis, the file would be reassigned without consequence or discussion. He trusted my judgment. I told him I'd give him my answer by end of day. That evening I drove home without registering a single stoplight. I sat on my back porch while the neighborhood got dark and thought through the situation carefully. Not the legal dimensions, which were straightforward, but the human ones, which weren't. I thought about the front desk staff at all 3 locations, the medical assistants, the billing coordinators, people whose paychecks had nothing to do with how a software configuration had been set up years ago, and everything to do with whether those clinics stayed operational. I thought about Glenda, who managed the Katy Freeway location and had a daughter starting college in the fall. I called Mr. O.C. the next morning before 7 and told him I'd lead the review. The first site visit was to the Katy Freeway location, the one with the gold letters above the entrance. Philip wasn't there that day. Glenda met us at the door with professional warmth, recognized me from a holiday party 2 years earlier, and offered coffee before I'd fully introduced myself. I accepted it and reminded myself that the most important thing I could do for everyone in that building was to do my job correctly. The documentation review stretched across 3 weeks and covered all 3 locations. My team pulled a stratified sample of visit records from throughout the 30-month window, cross-referenced billing codes against provider notes and check-in timestamps, and compared the documented complexity of each visit to the service level billed. The pattern that emerged was consistent and clear. The highest tier evaluation and management code had been applied to a substantial proportion of visits that lasted under 15 minutes and involved presentations. Upper respiratory infections, minor lacerations, urinary tract infections, blood pressure checks, that were routine by any clinical standard. The billing complexity implied a depth of medical decision-making that the visit notes simply didn't describe and the time logs couldn't support. I reviewed Philip's records exactly the way I reviewed every other provider's records, line by line, without assumptions in either direction. What the evidence showed was not fraud in any deliberate sense. There were no fabricated diagnoses, no invented patient visits, no documentation created after the fact. What existed was a systematic miscalibration, a billing configuration set up years earlier, never audited, never corrected, quietly inflating reimbursement levels as the practice volume grew. The problem wasn't dishonesty. It was the specific kind of negligence that develops when someone builds something successful and stops looking back at the foundation. In compliance work, that distinction matters enormously. It shapes everything that comes next. The family pressure started before our interim report was submitted. My mother called on a Wednesday evening while I was still at the office. She didn't ask how I was doing. She said she'd heard I was involved in reviewing Philip's clinics and needed me to understand what was at stake. She said Philip had worked his entire adult life to build something real. She said that whatever I thought about billing codes, he was not a dishonest person and that family was supposed to count for something. She said she'd raised us to take care of each other. I told her I knew that. She said, "Then act like it, Dana." I stayed quiet for a moment. Then I told her that acting like family meant doing the work correctly, because an inaccurate report would expose Philip to consequences far more serious than an accurate one ever could. She didn't have a response to that. She said she was going to say a prayer for all of us and hung up. 2 cousins texted me that same week. One asked if there was any flexibility in how compliance reviews worked. The other asked, more gently, if I could just let her know how things were going. I didn't respond to either message. Philip called my personal cell phone on a Friday afternoon. He sounded like a different version of himself, quieter, without the managed confidence that usually structured everything he said. He told me he'd learned I was leading the review. I said yes. He said he needed me to know he hadn't set out to do anything wrong. I told him I knew that. The billing system has been the same since we opened the first location, he said. I trusted the people I hired to manage it. I should have looked at it myself regularly. I didn't do that. I told him that distinction would be documented accurately in the final report. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Do they think it's over for us?" I recognized what he was actually asking beneath that question. He wanted to know if the practice he'd spent 12 years building was going to survive what was coming. I thought about every name in those personnel files, every family attached to every paycheck in those 3 buildings, and I gave him the only honest answer I had. They haven't decided yet. Our final report went to the insurer's legal team in early October. The findings were detailed and specific: $4.7 million in questioned claims across 30 months, attributable to systematic upcoding rather than any documented pattern of intentional fraud. Criminal referral was not recommended. A voluntary resolution framework was outlined. My name was on the signature line as lead analyst. The conditions the legal team sent back were extensive. Philip's practice would repay $3.1 million in questioned reimbursements on an agreed multi-year schedule. All 3 locations would submit to independent external billing audits annually for the next 3 years. A compliance officer, fully independent of Philip's management structure and reporting directly to the insurer, would be embedded in the organization. Billing software would be replaced entirely, and all administrative coding staff would undergo recertification before resuming claim submissions. Philip received the conditions on a Thursday. He didn't contact me until the following Monday. We met at a coffee shop on Washington Avenue. Wide windows, too much natural light, nowhere to disappear into. He was already there when I arrived, both hands wrapped around a mug, looking like someone who had not been sleeping well. We stayed for almost 2 hours, not to discuss the findings. Those were documented and final, and neither of us had anything to add. We talked about everything surrounding them: the grand opening, the parking lot, the years of dinners where Philip had spoken about me, the way people speak about someone who hasn't quite worked things out yet. He didn't use the word sorry. He said he'd been careless. I've thought about that word a lot since then, because I think it was the more honest choice. Sorry can mean almost anything, depending on who's saying it and why. Careless means you understand exactly what you failed to do. At one point he said, "I genuinely didn't know what you were building." I said, "I know." "I should have asked," he said. I didn't tell him he should have. That felt like a conversation that belonged to a version of us that no longer existed, and reopening it wouldn't have changed anything that actually mattered anymore. The repayment plan was executed on schedule over the following 2 years. The compliance infrastructure Philip put in place, cautiously at first, and then with something that looked increasingly like real commitment, became a model the insurer referenced in subsequent conversations with other providers about voluntary remediation programs. His practice cleared its next 2 external audits cleanly. No insurance contracts were lost. The staff whose names I'd worried about kept their jobs, most of them never knowing how close the question had been. The following spring, the Houston chapter of a regional medical compliance association held its annual ethics symposium. Mr. Ossie presented a session on documentation integrity and billing practices. Philip had been invited to sit on a panel about voluntary compliance restructuring. The organizers wanted a provider voice, someone who had navigated the process from the inside. I attended as part of Mr. Ossie's team. I hadn't expected Philip to be in the third row when we walked in, but his compliance officer had recommended he attend, and there he was. He saw me when I came through the door. He nodded once, I nodded back. During the panel, a physician in the audience asked what the hardest part of going through a compliance review had been. The question was addressed to the group, but Philip answered it. Realizing that I didn't actually know my own operation as well as I believed I did, he said. He paused. I had spent 12 years building and expanding and acquiring, and I had completely stopped looking back at what I'd already built. The billing configuration was one symptom of a larger problem. I had been moving fast and trusting systems I had never taken the time to verify. The room was quiet. The person who helped me understand that most clearly, he said slowly, wasn't a regulator, it wasn't an attorney, it was someone I had been casually dismissing for years, because I had already made up my mind about who she was. He didn't look toward me. My sister is a healthcare compliance analyst. She led the review of my practice. She was the most thorough and the most honest person in any room she walked into during that entire process. I was fortunate she was the one doing the work. I kept my face still. The thing that moved through me when he said it was quieter than I expected. Not triumph, not vindication, something smaller and more solid than either of those. Something closer to relief or resolution. The feeling you get when something that has been slightly out of alignment for a very long time finally settles into the right place. After the session ended, 3 people I'd never met introduced themselves and asked for my card. A compliance director from a regional hospital system, an administrator from a large physician group in the Woodlands, a representative from a CMS regional office who had read our report and said the upcoding analysis had been unusually well structured. I gave out 4 business cards I had not expected to need that day. Philip found me near the exit while the room was still emptying. He stood beside me without saying anything, for a moment, both of us watching the last few people file out. Then he said, "Mom's making brisket on Sunday, just thought you should know." I looked at him. "Is that an invitation?" "It's brisket," he said. "Draw your own conclusions." I smiled. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, and I had stopped needing it to be. It was an older brother, trying out a language he hadn't used much before, offering something without being asked for it, without being cornered into it, without expecting anything in return. Sometimes that's what real change looks like. It doesn't make a speech, it just shows up and mentions brisket. Things between Philip and me didn't transform overnight. We're not a call every week family, and some of the distance that accumulated over years of dinners and parking lots isn't simply going to dissolve. I've made my peace with that, but something shifted between that grand opening and that conference room, and the shift held, which was more than I had honestly expected. My mother started introducing me differently at family gatherings. Instead of vague gestures toward something in healthcare, she now says, "Dana does compliance analysis for medical providers," with a particular emphasis that tells me she's been practicing it. She's never directly addressed the investigation, or the Wednesday phone call, or the things she said about what family was supposed to mean. I've decided that matters less than I once thought. I was promoted to senior analyst last spring. Most of my work now involves helping clinics and physician groups build compliance programs before they need one imposed on them. Reviewing billing patterns, training administrative staff, identifying the places where good intentions and inadequate oversight create serious legal exposure. The people I work with are almost universally working hard and moving fast and trusting that what's behind them is sound. Most of the time it isn't, quite. And most of the time if someone catches it early, it's fixable. A few months ago, I was in the Katy Freeway office complex for a different client's quarterly review. I parked in the same lot I'd parked in nearly 3 years earlier, on my first site visit to Philip's clinic. I sat in the car for a minute before going inside. Through the clinic's front window, I could see the waiting room. The same chairs, the same front desk, the same framed credentials mounted on the wall. The gold letters above the entrance were still there. I sat there and thought for a moment about the October evening in that same parking lot. The blazer that wasn't quite formal enough. The crab cake, the 17 minutes before I finally drove home, the version of me who had sat in the same spot, wondering whether the things her family believed about her were simply the things that were true. Then I got out of the car and went inside to do my job. I still think about that version of myself sometimes. She didn't know yet that the most important thing she was building wasn't a certification or a title or a case file that would eventually carry her name on the signature line. It was the habit of showing up carefully, working honestly, and not needing anyone to look up and notice. She had been doing that her entire life. It just took the right moment for the rest of them to finally see it.